Most people are unknowingly living out the same emotional scripts, belief systems, and limitations their parents and grandparents carried. It's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. The problem we're going to solve today is this: how can a woman escape generational cycles that have shaped her identity, sabotaged her progress, and kept her playing small, so she can finally design a future based on intention, not inheritance? This is not just a motivational story. It's a blueprint to step out of the old and into the self you were meant to become. There comes a moment in every journey of awakening when you stop blaming life and begin questioning it. She didn't arrive at this insight through a dramatic event. It wasn't rock bottom. It wasn't heartbreak. It was something far more subtle, a quiet restlessness she couldn't shake, a whisper within that said, "This can't be all there is." She began to feel like a ghost inside her own life, following a path someone else had paved. The decisions she made, the emotions she felt, the way she responded to love, failure, stress, it all felt familiar. Too familiar, like a script she never wrote but somehow kept performing. That's when it hit her. What she called personality wasn't really her. It was programming. And that programming had been running her life. Awareness doesn't always come like a lightning bolt. Sometimes it's a slow unfolding. She started to notice how her thoughts were echoes of her mother's voice, how her inability to rest came from watching generations of women equate worth with productivity, how the anxiety she carried didn't belong solely to her. It had been passed down like an heirloom. She saw how her father's silence had taught her that emotions were dangerous. She recognized how conflict in her relationships followed the same emotional choreography she had witnessed in her childhood home. Until now, she had assumed this was normal. But the moment she saw it, she could no longer ignore it. This was the beginning of her transformation, not because she changed anything on the outside, but because she began to watch her own inner world like an observer. She started journaling her thoughts, not to fix them, but to see them. She practiced catching herself mid-reaction and asking, where did this come from? Is this mine, or was it given to me? With every layer she uncovered, she realized how deeply entangled her identity had become with her lineage. The fears she thought were personal were actually inherited. The limitations she believed were unique were generational. And the patterns she had normalized were quietly shaping her destiny. She began to understand something radical. You cannot change what you're not aware of. Most people are trapped in invisible cages, reacting to life with the same emotional vocabulary their parents used. They call it just how I am. But the truth is, they've never actually met who they really are, because who they are has been buried beneath years of generational emotional repetition. She decided she wasn't going to let history repeat itself through her. She would become the disruptor, the pattern breaker. But even awareness, while powerful, was not always comfortable. The more she saw, the more grief she felt. She grieved for the younger version of herself who had internalized rejection as unworthiness. She grieved for the dreams she had suppressed to keep others comfortable. She even grieved for her family, because once she recognized the source of their behavior, she no longer blamed them. She saw their patterns too, their wounds, their own programming. That realization softened her, but it also strengthened her, because now she understood that compassion doesn't mean compliance. She could love them and still choose a different path. There was a specific day she would never forget. She had a moment where, in the middle of a conflict, she caught herself about to explode with anger. It was the same anger she had seen generations express when they felt unheard. But this time she paused. She took a deep breath. She became aware. And in that pause, she reclaimed her power, not by reacting, but by choosing differently. That small shift from unconscious reaction to conscious awareness became the foundation of everything that followed. She began studying her triggers like a scientist. She noticed how scarcity showed up when she wanted to invest in herself, how shame surfaced when she tried to speak up. She traced these emotions back to childhood memories and even stories she had heard from her grandmother. She realized that patterns don't just exist in behavior. They live in the body, in the nervous system, in the emotional memory stored deep within. And to break them, you don't just change your mind. You recondition your entire internal landscape. That's when her mornings began to change. She started her days not by checking her phone or rushing into tasks, but by sitting in silence, tuning into her breath, observing her thoughts, noticing the emotional residue of yesterday. She didn't judge it. She just watched it. And slowly, that presence became power. The power to no longer be a puppet of her past, the power to respond with intention, the power to observe an old pattern arise and not follow it. Because once she saw the pattern, she could step outside it. Once she became aware of the patterns that had shaped her for so long, something inside her shifted. Awareness was the key, yes, but unlocking the door was only the beginning. If she wanted to step into a new life, she had to do more than just recognize the old one. She had to rewire her entire internal operating system. And that meant confronting one of the most uncomfortable truths of all. She had been addicted to her old self. Her identity wasn't fixed. It was familiar. That was the trap. For years, she thought change was about action, changing jobs, changing relationships, changing locations. But all of that was external. Real transformation had nothing to do with the outside world. It had everything to do with what she believed about herself, deep down, in the invisible world of her subconscious mind. That part of her brain had been programmed early, long before she was old enough to question anything. The stories, emotions, and assumptions wired into her nervous system in childhood had become the foundation of her reality. She realized that over 90% of her daily actions, emotional reactions, and decisions were driven not by her conscious will, but by a silent, automatic program running in the background. And that program had one job: to keep her in the known, not in the joyful, not in the expansive, but in the familiar. And so even when she consciously wanted to grow, to succeed, to love fully, her subconscious would pull her back into the loop she had always known. That's when she stopped trying to fix her life from the outside and started creating a new one from the inside. She began the practice of mental rehearsal, not just thinking about the woman she wanted to become, but feeling her, embodying her. She would wake up each morning and imagine, what does she think about when she opens her eyes? How does she walk into a room? How does she speak when she's fully grounded in her worth? What choices does she make when she knows she is enough? The mind doesn't distinguish between real experience and vividly imagined experience. So she trained her brain to believe a new story. She visualized her future self so clearly, so frequently, that the neural pathways in her brain began to change. The old stories: I'm not enough, I always get left, I can't trust people, abundance isn't for me. They lost their charge, not overnight, but gradually, like a radio frequency she no longer tuned into. And in their place, new beliefs began to take root, beliefs she had never known she was allowed to have. I am worthy of peace. I am safe to expand. I am the creator, not the victim. She didn't just repeat affirmations. She became them. She allowed herself to feel the truth of what she was creating. Because that's how the subconscious gets reprogrammed, not through words alone, but through emotion. Emotion is the glue that binds a new idea to the nervous system. So each morning she'd close her eyes, drop into her heart, and feel the joy of the life she hadn't yet lived, as if it were already hers, not hoping, not waiting, but claiming, experiencing, practicing the future so often that it became her new baseline. And then something profound happened. She started to act differently. Without forcing it, she stopped seeking approval. She said no when she used to say yes. She walked away from chaos without guilt. She stopped over-explaining, stopped shrinking, stopped performing. Her choices began to match her internal transformation. People around her noticed the shift. Some supported it, others resisted it, but she no longer needed consensus. She was no longer outsourcing her identity to others. the more she rehearsed the future, the more she disarmed the past. Old emotional triggers began to fade. Situations that once unraveled her became opportunities to stay grounded. She still felt fear, still faced uncertainty, but she no longer let those emotions drive the bus. She watched them, she breathed through them, and then she chose differently. That's what rewiring looks like. Not never feeling fear again, but no longer being ruled by it. Her inner dialogue changed. The inner critic that used to whisper, "You're not ready, you'll mess it up, stay small," that voice grew quieter. Not because she fought it, but because she stopped feeding it. She was feeding something else now, the voice of her future. The voice that said, "You're allowed to take up space, you're allowed to lead, you're allowed to feel good." This process wasn't a one-time breakthrough, it was a daily commitment. Every day, she had to decide who she was going to be, not based on her history, but based on her vision. And that meant showing up for her future self now. Before the evidence, before the applause, before the results, it meant becoming the woman who had already arrived even while she was still in transition. Because the brain, when trained correctly, stops asking, "Is it here yet?" and starts believing it's already mine. And when you live in that truth long enough, reality eventually catches up. Even after she began rewiring her subconscious identity, something strange kept happening. She would wake up feeling aligned, visualizing her future self, feeling empowered and clear. But by the afternoon, she would find herself falling back into old emotions. Shame would sneak in. Anxiety would rise without a trigger. Her mind would spiral back into scarcity, comparison, or guilt. It was like being pulled backward by something invisible, something ancient, something familiar. That's when she came to understand a powerful truth. The body remembers the past more than the mind does. And she had become addicted to the emotional chemistry of her former self. Her nervous system was still wired to survive, not thrive. And even though her conscious mind was reaching for freedom, her body was still trying to protect her by keeping her in the emotional states it knew best. That's what emotional addiction really is, when your body craves the very emotions you're trying to escape. Not because they feel good, but because they feel familiar. Familiarity is the language of safety to a dysregulated nervous system. So even emotions like sadness, frustration, helplessness, these became her comfort zone. They were part of her identity for so long that she didn't know who she was without them. She realized that healing wasn't just about thinking new thoughts. It was about breaking a biological habit of being herself, her old self. The self who always expected disappointment, who lived in anticipation of pain, who couldn't fully receive love because it felt foreign. And every time she tried to embody her new identity, her body would pull her back into the emotional past because that's where it felt safe, not happy. Safe. But she wasn't going to let her biology write her future. She started observing her emotions with a new kind of awareness. Not as enemies to be defeated, but as signals of what was still active within her body. When shame arose, instead of suppressing it or spiraling in it, she asked, "What story is this shame trying to keep alive?" When fear surfaced, she would breathe into it and say, "I'm not in danger anymore." She began to see her emotional reactions not as truth, but as echoes. Echoes of the girl who had been hurt, who had been told she wasn't enough, who had learned to self-protect through overthinking and withdrawal. But she wasn't that girl anymore. And the emotions tied to that identity were no longer hers to carry. Every day became a practice of interrupting the old emotional signals. She became hyper-aware of when her body was trying to return to the past. She noticed how stress would arise the moment she tried something new. How guilt would surface when she honored her boundaries. How sadness would whisper when she began to feel joy, as if to say, "Don't get too used to this. It won't last." But she no longer believed those voices. She stayed present. She breathed through the discomfort. And most importantly, she didn't react. That was her breakthrough, learning how to feel the old emotions without feeding them. She could observe anger without becoming angry. She could notice fear without making it her identity. She stopped reinforcing the old neural loops by giving them her energy. Instead, she brought her awareness back to the present moment, over and over again, because the present was the only place her future could be created. And in those moments of awareness, she practiced choosing a new emotion, not forcing it, not faking it, but gently guiding herself into a new state of being. Gratitude, calm, expansion. These emotions felt foreign at first. Her body resisted them. But the more she practiced them, the more natural they became. She was no longer reacting from her past. She was creating from her future. This didn't mean she never got triggered, but her relationship with her triggers changed. Instead of collapsing into them, she got curious. Instead of replaying old stories, she rewrote them. Her triggers became teachers. Her discomfort became data. Every time she stayed conscious in the face of an old pattern, she weakened its grip. Her body began to trust the new emotions. Her nervous system began to regulate. Her baseline of being began to shift from fight or flight to peace, from vigilance to trust, from survival to creation. She became aware of how often people confuse normal with natural. Just because she was used to chaos didn't mean chaos was natural. Just because she was used to anxiety didn't mean anxiety was part of her design. Her true nature had always been calm, creative, intuitive, grounded. But she had to unlearn the emotional programs layered over that essence. She had to detox from the chemical cocktail of her past identity. Each time she chose stillness over stress, each time she stayed open instead of shutting down, each time she allowed herself to feel joy without guilt, she was breaking a neural addiction. She was teaching her body a new emotional language. And over time, that language became fluent. Her body stopped craving the old chemistry. It began to crave peace. It began to crave alignment. It began to crave the future she had been rehearsing. And that's when the emotional gravity of her past finally began to lose its pull. As her emotional blueprint evolved and the past lost its grip, she stepped into the most profound realization of all, that she was not here to simply heal, react, or repair. She was here to create, not just survive, not just break patterns, but build a reality so aligned, so intentional that her future would never again be shaped by unconscious repetition. She wasn't just the product of her upbringing, her wounds, or her past anymore. She was the architect. And from that day forward, she started building her life brick by brick, with presence, vision, and conscious design. Becoming the architect of her life meant taking full ownership of her energy. She no longer chased people, outcomes, or timelines. She began living as if what she desired was already unfolding, because she had internalized something most people never grasp. The external world reflects the internal one. It's not what you say you want, it's what you believe you deserve. And every day she practiced aligning her energy, not with what had been, but with what could be. Her mornings became sacred. Before the world could shape her, she shaped herself. She would rise in silence, place her hand on her heart, and breathe life into her future. Not through willpower or force, but through deep coherence. She would feel the gratitude for a life not yet visible. She would embody the emotions of a woman who had already received the love, the freedom, the creativity, and the peace she desired. She wasn't asking the universe for permission. She was communicating through frequency. She was sending out a clear signal. This is who I am now. And reality began to respond. In this new state, decisions no longer came from fear. She didn't ask, what will they think? Or what if I fail? She asked, does this match the future I'm building? Her standards shifted. The way she spent her time, the people she allowed in her energy, the content she consumed, it all became part of the architecture of her becoming. She no longer tolerated what drained her. Not because she was hard or cold, but because she was clear. And clarity is magnetic. It creates order in a chaotic world. She began surrounding herself with environments that reflected her vision. She curated her space to feel like her future self lived there. She dressed as the woman she was becoming. She spoke words that uplifted. She moved her body as if it belonged to someone deeply in tune with life. These were not acts of pretending, they were acts of alignment. And alignment is not about faking confidence. It's about remembering the truth underneath the noise. She realized something profound. Most people are living in reaction to their circumstances, waiting for life to give them a sign, an opportunity, a break. But true creators don't wait. They initiate. They become the signal. They don't just hope for love. They become love. They don't wait for freedom. They embody freedom. They don't chase abundance. They think, feel, and act as if it's already within them. She stopped waiting. And in that shift, life began organizing around her. There were moments, of course, when the old self tried to resurface, times when doubt crept in, or the outside world tested her faith. But she had built something stronger than motivation. She had built identity, and identity doesn't falter when the world gets loud. It holds. It leads. It reminds you who you are when you forget. And from this new foundation, she began creating results that once felt impossible. Not just externally, though those came too, but internally. She experienced peace she didn't know was available. She became magnetic to aligned relationships. She started attracting opportunities that matched her elevated state. It wasn't magic, it was mechanics. When your inner world becomes coherent, your outer world reorganizes to match it. This is how she became the architect of her life, not by controlling every detail, but by becoming so deeply aligned that life had no choice but to mirror her back. Her legacy wasn't just in what she achieved, it was in what she transmitted. She became a living example of what's possible when you choose to become conscious, when you stop inheriting your life and start designing it. Her family began to feel the ripple. Her friends noticed the difference. She didn't have to preach or convince. She just embodied. And embodiment is the most powerful form of leadership. She had dismantled the scaffolding of generational pain, fear, and smallness, and replaced it with a blueprint of intentionality, freedom, and expansion. Not only had she healed herself, she had changed the trajectory for every life connected to hers. Her children, her community, her lineage, they would walk through doors she had built with her daily choices. And that was her greatest act of creation. She did not just heal, she transformed. She dismantled inherited limitations, reprogrammed the subconscious mind that had been silently scripting her destiny, and broke the emotional addiction to a past that was never hers to carry. And through each brave, conscious choice, she became the architect of her life, not by controlling every circumstance, but by mastering her internal state. She stopped waiting for external permission to evolve. She stopped seeking safety in the familiar, and she stopped defining herself by the patterns that belonged to generations before her. What began as survival turned into vision. What once felt like brokenness became the raw material for wholeness. She proved that we do not need to repeat what we inherited. We do not need to become a reflection of our past. We are not victims of our history. We are the authors of what comes next. And in choosing to break the cycle, she didn't just rewrite her story. She became a living transmission of what's possible for every woman who dares to look within and choose differently. She did not escape the past by running from it. She rose above it by becoming someone entirely new. In every breath, every thought, every decision, she aligned her energy with the life she was creating. And as she did, reality followed. Because the moment you claim your power from within, life mirrors it without. She is not just free, she is the blueprint, a reminder to all of us that the future is not found, it is built. Thought by thought, emotion by emotion, choice by choice. She became the architect, and now so can you.